4 o'clock block here on Monday. I'm Jay Fidell. This is ThinkTech. More specifically, this is Hawaii, the state of clean energy. And we have Josh Powell, the CEO of RevoluSun, very important solar installer company, and much more here in Hawaii today. Josh, say hi.
Hey, everybody. Great to be here. Jay,
I want
good to talk to
to
you.
get a handle from you on what's going on. You know, we talked before the show about where are we, and by that I mean where are we in the continuum from here to 100% renewables, which actually doesn't seem any closer than it did a few years ago. But the Hawaiian Electric RPS is doing pretty good anyway. Their average for their islands is something, I don't know, 35, 40%, pretty good. And that's happened. But I don't have. I was telling you before. I don't have a sense of where we are on the continuum. I'm not sure I see breakneck speed. Although my guess is that if anybody is moving on this, it's RevoluSun. Where are we, Josh? Give me a handle on where we are.
Well, number one, when I started in this industry with my partners, more than, I don't know, we're talking over 10 years ago, which is many lifetimes, I think, in solar at this point. We were still, our grid in Hawaii was over 95% fossil fuel. And now we're looking at, getting under 80%. And I mean, that's a pretty profound change right there. And it's very quantifiable and it relates directly to renewable energy. But beyond that, I think, and in particular, when we look at sort of the urgency we're starting to see with almost everybody regarding climate change, and I would broadly put COVID in that category. I'd put the stuff we're seeing in Texas in that category, the stuff we've seen in the wildfires in California last year. They're all kind of there. And we've been lucky in Hawaii the last couple of years. We've kind of dodged the storms. But if we remember back about 2-3 years ago, there's those famous pictures of, a dozen hurricanes all sort of surrounding the islands. And, we're very lucky. We have those wonderful mountains to the east that kind of give us a shield that most islands don't have. Most other island nations don't really have that. But I think we recognize how important resilience is, and resilience is a bunch of things, right? Keeping the economy local. I mean, that's like one of the biggest fundamental things. I think what we do ties back into local agriculture, all sorts of things. So what I've seen in the last couple of years as fully sort of autonomous integrated energy systems have really come to the fore. So we're talking about PV plus storage. I think the most common thing people talk about or think about is a Tesla Powerwall, but there's a range of products now in the battery space. It's growing. That is making the energy systems we put on rooftops, the solar systems that we've been installing for well over a decade, making them fundamentally autonomous. And in a crazy way, the end of net metering back in 2015, let's just say the 2013 to 2015 period, that was a really dark period for solar installers. A lot of people went out of business. It really changed the business. But I hate to say it, but in some ways, perhaps that was a favor for us in the sense that we have now kind of unburdened ourselves from the tether to the grid. And that's not to say the grid isn't important. The grid is still, in fact, I think in some ways the grid is becoming more relevant because we have all of these tiny little power plants arrayed around the grid. You've probably maybe talked a little bit about this, but we're involved in a pretty significant virtual power plant project that's gotten a little bit of press recently, that is just barely getting started. So it's not really out there yet, but there's a couple of grid services programs now in Hawaii. Hawaii, frankly, is leading the nation with this kind of activity. And it's a recognition.
What is the virtual grid?
So all of these systems, all these little solar plus storage systems, have a battery resource on them, and that resource can be used by the homeowner to save money, to provide resilience, to have autonomy. But those things are also buffering capacity that can be used by the grid as a whole. So you can simultaneously use all of those systems at once with software. And so imagine in the last, I think we might have even talked about this briefly last time I was on, but in the last couple of years, our customers, and this is just RevoluSun, there's obviously other companies are deploying batteries too, but our customers alone are well over 10 megawatts of instantaneous capacity. So you think about that, that's a little peaker, that's a little power plant that you could instantaneously discharge. And there's enough energy in those batteries that you could do that for a couple of hours if you needed to. So it's a tremendous resource. It can absorb energy. So it's bidirectional, it can discharge energy. It's sending energy out in a perfect 60 hertz sine wave. And most people don't think too much, but we're in the energy geek world here, right? And we know that if any, Hawaii, one of the biggest problems on Hawaii's grid is we don't have a lot of interconnections. So we have this grid that spreads out and sort of terminates at the edge. And that means we have some frequency problems often. We have lower frequency at the edge of the grid. Now we're actually putting all these little robust systems out at the edge of the grid, and they can actually eliminate those kinds of things. You can have better energy, or better like things that we are maybe used to in our lives, like the power supply for your computer burning out every couple of years. Doesn't need to really happen. If you have better power on the system, better energy, then those things last better or last longer.
Well, for the virtual power plant, I mean, what I'm getting is that you can take a number of homes or installations, and they all have good modern technology. They're all running 60 hertz, what have you, and connect them up, and then they can act as a power plant to save each one. In other words, if anything goes wrong on one of them, the other ones come right in. It reminds me of Wi-Fi. Originally, it used to be that you had to connect every node, and you had a lot of trouble in getting distances, getting the signal to go distances between the nodes. But then, and actually, there was a lot of research done here in Manoa, in the Manoa Innovation Center, on this very thing. Tarek Hawk was the guy's name, and he was a really smart engineer person. And he invented or developed this thing called mesh technology. So if you connected the signal at one end of a large area that had mesh nodes, then it would flow through all the nodes and it would saturate the entire area of the mesh. And so everybody around that mesh would have signal. It sounds to me like there's a parallel between that and this virtual power plant thing you're talking about. So if you have all these various RevoluSun houses all talking to each other, sending power, they become a virtual power plant for all of the members of the mesh. Am I right? Is that a way to look at it?
Jay, as usual, you're like one step beyond, but where the virtual power plants are starting is what we call grid services. So right now it's looking at that resource as a single, combined resource that can assist the grid operator. So HECO is a participant in this, right? And customers will be able to sign up and they'll get a little bit of compensation for participating. So they can save a little extra money, which is great. So I want to stop on that for a second. And this is really important. One of the big arguments in the past has been solar is a big tax on the grid, right? It costs more to facilitate it. And the reality is once these resources are there, they're actually very valuable to the grid. And so they create more relevance. We're going to essentially prove the case in Hawaii over the next couple of years that by aggregating customers that own their own solar systems, or even maybe they lease the system, they don't necessarily have to own it, right? Somebody else could own it, but they contribute that resource and they get something back. Maybe they'll get, a couple bucks a month off their electrical bill, maybe 20 bucks a month off their electrical bill, depending on how much they are able to participate. And their participation is going to do things like help the frequency regulation on the grid so that we have, cleaner power, potentially absorb energy if there's an overproduction, like maybe wind is really moving and we don't want to lose that energy. We don't want to curtail. And deliver energy if we have failure. So I think if you look to Texas, you could potentially have avoided shutdowns by having the right amount of capacity on the grid. The shutdown, having too little or too much energy on the grid at any one time could, cause real problems for a power plant, for instance. And if you don't have a place to buffer that energy, your only alternative as a grid operator is to just shut it off, right? To avoid, problems.
So the utility grid is the mesh that I was talking about.
Yes.
Everybody feeds into it and everybody takes out of it, but that would depend, just as you say, that would depend on the quality of the software to move the power around, move the energy around. And clearly in Texas, they weren't focused on that, and look what happened.
In Texas, they don't have the resource. So Hawaii is really different. We've already been deploying for a year. At like that example I said earlier, we've got, actually we're probably up to close to 15 megawatts of deployed customer centric energy. So we're putting another 5 to 10 megawatts of that in every year. And then there's, how many other installers doing it at the same time. So in a way, the small solar installers out there are, every couple of years, we're building a new power plant. I mean, I think what's AES, 80 megawatt power plant. We're going to do 80 megawatts of solar plus storage. And this is the power rating of the storage. We'll probably be done with that in another 2 years, 3 years on the grid in residential systems.
Well, let's talk about storage for a minute. Although the legislature has not yet seen fit to give a tax credit for additional storage that a homeowner might want to put on, which is really too bad. Fact is that when you build a new installation, you're going to put storage on it. You're going to suggest it to the owner, and I guess most of the time the smart owner will say yes.
Virtually 100% of new customers are purchasing storage.
There you go. I had a feeling. Okay, so now we have a lot of new installations out there with solar and storage. What I don't know, I'd like to know from you, is how that interacts with the grid, the utility grid, and other customers. So I want to top off my storage all the time. I want to be able to rely on my own independent system as much as I can. But there are times when I want to feed it back into the grid, and I guess that would that go directly from the solar, or would it go from the storage, or would it go from both, or is there some sort of algorithm that selects where it comes from to go back?
It could be either. Frankly, electrons don't care. And the device that manages it. I mean, electrons are, plumbing is the best analogy, but water goes wherever the open, it's going to follow pressure, and electrons follow load. So if there's a requirement for energy, they're going to go there very quickly. And the simple thing, electrons are moving at close to the speed of light in a wire, right? So if you are controlling it with a signal from software, the signal is basically instantaneous, and the movement of the energy is instantaneous. So when you think about the advantages of a virtual power, ability to discharge energy to engage the grid, it's and if it's driven by algorithms, it's essentially, it's instantaneous. There's no delay. So firing up a power plant, any other form of energy production that we've typically been used to, there's a delay. It takes time to ramp up a generator. Takes, starting a power plant can take days sometimes, right? Firing up, ramping a generator that's already in production, ramping it up, increasing the revolutions, things like that, just like accelerating in your car. It takes a little while. Energy stored in a battery at your house, in your neighbor's house, and if you're in Manoa, somebody at Eva Beach, doesn't matter. I mean, to the virtual power plant, it's indistinguishable. It's all the same.
So these batteries that people want and that you are installing in all of the new installations, are they enough? Are they sufficient to keep the home going? I don't know what it takes to, how many kilowatt
Yeah,
hours it takes, but all day, all night, like on a perpetual basis.
I would say that, everybody gets their, what they want in terms of a system. And most people start with how much energy do they consume on a daily and an annual basis. And a system is typically designed around offsetting that as much as possible. Then there's other constraints. You may, depends on how much room you have on your roof and things like that. We usually design the storage based on what the consumer's behavior is. So are they at home during the day? Are they, obviously that changed for a whole bunch of us during COVID, right? It used to be that a lot of families would use most of their energy at night. So in the last year, a lot of people have been at home. And that, part of the, as we look back at 2020, what happened? I think for almost every solar business in the state, they grew. We almost all grew. So it's kind of a bright spot in the economy relative to, some of the challenges elsewhere in tourism, things like that.
Why did that happen?
Because I think people were at home and they were thinking about their homes and they were thinking about what kinds of improvements they needed to make. Obviously there's plenty of economic challenges that come with this thing, especially in Hawaii, with the loss of tourism, the loss of revenue from the outside. But I mean, in a subtle way, every time we put a new solar system in, those are dollars that stay in Hawaii, right? I mean, we're offsetting the spend that
Sure.
in Hawaii. So every time we add it, we're enhancing our own economy.
Before the show began, I was telling you about my friend in Portland who was concerned about blackouts in that area, and I guess he wasn't the only one. A lot of his friends in Portland installed generators,
Mhm.
and since there's there's infrastructure for natural gas, it's connected generated to natural gas. And he said that's easier than having diesel fuel available or even gasoline available, and it's safer and so forth. And so it said it cost him $12,000 to do that. And I was really interested in the reason he did it, of course, is that he wanted to achieve some, what do you want to call it, resilience for his electrical supply. And we don't realize how very totally inconvenient it is not to have power in the house. The people in Texas are only finding that out now. And even now, he doesn't have broadband. He has power in the house, but no broadband. And you don't realize how dependent we are on broadband. But you were mentioning that these days, when you install solar together with storage, you have a similar kind of technology where if the power from the grid fails for any reason, the thing clicks in immediately. You see a flash, maybe, and lights go, well, they're off already, but
Milliseconds. So
millisecond and bingo.
yeah, so yeah, any energy storage system we put in typically comes with a whole house ATS. Usually it's a 200 amp automatic transfer switch. And it's imperceptible. You won't see a light flicker, clock disrupted. So it's very, it's subtle, but I think there's a lot of broad application for, and it's funny, Hawaii did not start down the path of energy storage based on resilience. It started because people wanted to save money. We still have some of the highest cost of energy in the country. Maybe not. There were some spot prices in Texas in the last week that were pretty crazy. I did one calculation. I think $9,000 a megawatt hour. It was something like, it was just a crazy number, like $9 a kilowatt hour, 30 times what we pay in Hawaii. So our systems give the consumer the ability to operate continually, so that you're cycling the energy every day. You put some of the solar in the battery, then you use it at night instead of buying from the grid. But in an outage, even a multi-day outage, the system would be cycling just with the solar and the battery, and you would be functioning autonomously from the grid. And you have an application on your phone that, whether you have internet or not, it has a local area network, so it's going to tell you what's going on, what's your state of energy. Do you need to, if you need to behave a little differently to make sure that maybe it's dark, maybe you've got some clouds overhead, you need to, watch your consumption. So it's your own power plant. You need to be a little more interactive. You can't have the same attitude that we've traditionally had with a utility where they're just delivering energy at whatever level we want.
Let me ask you this though. I like to think of things in sort of in a futuristic kind of way. And what we have is dynamic change here. We have, I mean, you're not the only installer company, but you've installed a lot of solar in 2020 because of people being home and having that nesting feeling, make them want to take care of their property, what have you, whatever reasons there might be. And so it's a whole new market generation almost because of COVID. And it's probably going that way in the future too, because I think the lessons we have learned in COVID will continue on a momentum basis, but also on the basis of fear of what happened in Texas. It's that, that climate change is interesting. All this green energy is to minimize climate change. And yet climate change actually makes it more necessary to have independent systems. If look at Texas, they were relying on a system that was the system was not up to par. The regulators and the state of Texas didn't do a good job, and so that it didn't work. And that was, I attribute that storm to climate change. And the same in other places like the wildfires in the Pacific Northwest. I attribute that to climate change. And when anything like that happens, any kind of calamity, kind of natural disaster that's related to climate change, that affects your electrical supply. That affects the utility, affects the grid, affects the power lines, it affects, all those systems that are exposed to the elements, the fires, the storms, what have you. And so if you wanted to have your own personal resilience, you would call it installer like RevoluSun, and you would say, put in a system for me. I don't want to worry about this all day. I'll pay the price. I don't want to worry about it all day. I think the utility probably understands this as well as anyone. So what I see happening here, correct me, what I see happening is that more and more people over the years to come are going to do exactly that. As these storms and floods and what have you happen, they're going to worry about, their own security, electrical energy security, and they're going to want to do that. My question to you, I was getting to a question. My question to you is, what does that all mean going forward? What does it mean for RevoluSun? What does it mean for the utility? What does it mean for the average Joe? What does it mean for the guy who cannot afford to put a rooftop system on? Because I think things are changing. That's the premise of my question.
It means for RevoluSun is that we are a consumer energy services business. And that means that, we love all of our customers. And so some of our customers can own the system themselves and pay for it themselves, and take the tax value, things like that, the incentives that we're used to for themselves. Other people, maybe they don't have that kind of cash, and they need to with it. So, when I look at, our business has to look at ways to finance that for people, right? Down to we own some of the systems we install for our customers. So we have to, that part of your service to the customer is figuring out what's going to make it easy for them to get the system. So that's one. Who are we? We're providing a service that people want, and so we have to understand our customers and respond to the things that they want. So in the case of RevoluSun, only a solar company plus storage, but we're really a smart home company. So we're providing the most efficient air conditioning. We provide roofing. We provide other products that relate to the things that our customers want. We clean systems. We maintain systems. So we have to think about what they really want and provide those services. And I think in that respect, we're a little bit different than the typical utility we're used to, where it's, they don't have a lot of adaptation or variation in what they deliver. They just do the same thing. We really look at our customers, we listen to them, and we try to understand what they want. And then, of course, we're in this really radically changing technology. So we have to educate, we have to teach people and help them understand what's out there. But I think that's the other big piece of this, Jay. You related a lot of examples, but and I agree with that, and I think it's very accurate in terms of what is happening. But what's happening with the grid and what's happening with this technology doesn't, frankly, have much to do with climate change. It's really, we've been in an electrical grid. We've been in a system that was designed almost 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago in some ways, and it's been operated in much the same way. But what has happened in the last 3 decades with both photovoltaics and high density energy storage, so non-lead acid, lithium ions, the most common thing now, but we're going to see continual development of these technologies. I mean, they've been developing in the last couple decades, but we're going to see really rapid continual development. That is changing the nature of how we operate a grid. And it's frankly really beneficial to consumers because it does all these other things you were talking about. It gives us resilience. It helps make the grid more secure. It helps make us safer when we have variations in climate, storms, things like that.
Yeah, so it strikes me that the model of the John Doe model, he's going to want to have security. He's going to want to put the money down. He's going to want to have, when I say security, I mean the option to disconnect anytime.
Yep.
And I think the utility is okay with that. The utility is willing to let him disconnect anytime. And so I think I see a community going forward. You're not finished. What I mean is you've installed what, 10,000 units already. You're going to start to go back to the first one again, right? The new technology comes, you go back to number one and start the whole process again. Only this time it's 20,000 units. And after a while, and not too many years really, you get the whole thing done again with the latest technology. And that will evolve into a situation where a good percentage of the people in your community, your installed community, will have these options, will have the ability to disconnect and be completely independent and so forth. This will change the business. It will change the business of the utility. It will change the way the PUC looks at things. It will change, the value of your company as a continuing maintenance experience for people, as you mentioned. So I think we're in a change here in Hawaii, and I'm not sure that's different from the way it would be in other states. I think the U.S. We used to think that Hawaii was way ahead. I think that there's a certain parity going on now where it's sort of settling down. You can disagree with me. Where we're all at about the same technology, but the systems are different. That's all. The regulation's different. Bottom line, and I want to ask you about this. Bottom line is, it will be different, and we will find that the community will have, in large part, the option to disconnect for their own security. All right.
No, that's, I mean, we're essentially there, on Oahu right now. There's figure, 6 or 7 thousand residential systems that have that ability today. So if a hurricane hit the island and we had a really disruptive event, we would have thousands of consumers that already had the ability to continue to operate their energy system independent of the grid, whether it's up or down. And I always think to myself, generosity kicks in at that point, and you're going to be throwing extension cords over the fence to make sure your refrigerator, your neighbor's refrigerator is up, or, your tutu down the street, the oxygen's squared away, or, whatever, it gives the community, you think about community resilience, to have all those nodes of autonomy isn't just about me. It gives the whole community a resource. And we have a greater density of that in Hawaii than probably anywhere else, maybe Puerto Rico. They've had tremendous development in Puerto Rico in the last couple of years because of Typhoon or Hurricane Maria.
They had to.
Yeah, they had to, absolutely. I mean, that was how back.
Well, this takes us back to the whole thing about mesh. You said I was ahead of the game, and okay, sometimes I get lost, but it seems to me that the future includes that it's that power line over the back fence to the neighbor's refrigerator. It's the Wheeler doctrine. Remember that, out of Texas?
Yep.
Where anybody can sell to anybody. It's community solar. It's community solar gone big, gone large. And I think after a while, well, aren't we going to see this? We're going to see, RevoluSun building a kind of community solar power line over the back fence, Wheeler kind of arrangement, where you have this de facto virtual mesh neighborhood supply system. Is that in the cards?
It is, and so that this takes us back to Texas. So Texas is ERCOT is the Texas grid regulator, and Texas is a deregulated grid, right? They did that about 20 years ago. And, in many ways, Texas has been looked at as a grid of the future. So, but one of the mistakes of Texas's grid is that they focused on lowest cost. So they drove down the infrastructure support and didn't have the resilience they needed built into the grid to provide security. And I think there will be many more experiments with that. But when you talk about wheeling, particularly between consumers, that means the first step for that is to actually open it up so that you can have that kind of relationship with your neighbor or somebody down the street. But the software and the controls that we talk about for a modern virtual power plant, where distributed generation systems are supporting the utility, and then there's some compensation that comes back to the system owner, it's essentially the same thing. And the same software could support consumer to consumer. We're going to start with consumer to business or business to consumer, but the same thing can end up in a C2C relationship. And I mean, when you think about electric vehicles and general electrification of our consumer products and such, it makes sense that eventually we end up in that place.
Well, boy, I feel that we had no idea we'd go in all these places today. Josh, thank you very much for tracking around on all these issues with me.
We just need to forget about COVID, move on, right?
Yes, so I hope we can continue this conversation again later, because I think it's going to be in play for a long time, and it's right now it's not completely predictable. But one thing is sure: change itself, change is sure. So I hope we can discuss it some more. Thank you very much, Josh Powell, CEO of RevoluSun, a very important installer company and more in Hawaii. Aloha.